All right, well, welcome to another great Lunch and Learn. Today we have Art of Procurement, Head of Community Outreach, Helen Mackenzie. You'll see Helen here on the screen. Go ahead and wave, Helen. Now, Helen is a leading creator and distributor of multi-channel content aimed at educating and inspiring procurement leaders around the world. She's a former UK public sector executive who covered procurement and financial services. During her time as a senior leader, Helen devised and implemented award-winning practice combining procurement and community engagement. Helen is the author of procurement study guides on category management, systems technology, and commercial data management. She serves on a number of boards and is the Audit and Risk Committee Chair of the Scottish Public Pensions Agency, which administers the pension schemes for the National Health Service, Teachers, Policy, and Fire Service in Scotland. So Helen will be presenting with us today to share the Art of Procurement's goal to multiply the impact of procurement and the resources they provide to support this mission. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Helen. I've also typed in the chat there. If you guys have any questions, feel free to go ahead and type them in the chat. And then as we go along, we'll kind of interject if we have any burning questions. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and turn over to Helen Mackenzie.
Thanks very much, Alexa. Thank you very much. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today. So I'll just get my screen shared and then we can make a start. I can put the slideshow on. There we go. Right. Okay, so as Alexa said, I'm Helen Mackenzie and I'm the head of community outreach at Art of Procurement. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about me, then a bit about Art of Procurement, and then I'm going to talk about the task that Robert set for me, which was to suggest a few ways that you can think about improving your alignment to the larger county and business goals. So I've got a bit of a background in public procurement. I hope I've got a few stories from you from my time that can help you with what you do in terms of your procurement practice. So let's talk first about Art of Procurement. Here are some numbers for you. We've got 24,000 members of our community across the globe, 5,600 plus companies, including agencies, government bodies like yourself in our community. Our podcast, which is the flagship thing we do, Art of Procurement, has surpassed 1 million downloads this year. And, you know, from the point of view of any podcast, that's pretty significant. But for a procurement podcast, that's absolutely fabulous. And it's testimony to Phil, our founder's dedication over the last 8 years in keeping that podcast going and producing that content every week. The podcast actually grew last year by 93%, so we're sort of exponentially getting more listeners. And the procurement podcasts that we do, which I'll talk about in a minute, constitute 80% of the procurement podcast market. So if you're listening to a procurement podcast, it may well be you're listening to one in our family. Okay, a little bit more about our community then. As you'll see from these stats, 50% of our community are based in North America, so like in with your good selves in North America. We've also got 26% with myself. I'm based over here in Europe, and the rest of the world constitute the other figures. And as we're an English-speaking podcast, you know, that makes sense, and the English-speaking content that we produce in terms of the language. You see from the buy-side practitioner split there on the bottom left corner of the slide, we've got a good spread between what I'd call big cheeses, senior leaders, CPOs, people in senior positions, through to people who are making individual contributions to the team, like buyers, like category leads, like procurement analysts. Perhaps that's your job title and that's what you do. So the full spread of people who've got very strategic views of procurement through to people that are just trying to get the job done. Okay, just a little bit more about what we do. So down the middle stream there is the podcast. So Art of Procurement, and Procurement 6 are on the same feed in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, if you've ever heard an ad like that. Art of Procurement is the long form sort of interview based podcast which Phil leads on, and that happens on a Monday. That goes into the feed on a Monday. Procurement 6 drops into the feed on a Friday, and it's a short-term newsy type podcast, and myself, Phil and Kelly take turns to host that, and I'm on next week. So if you sign up this week, you'll hear me next week. I might even mention the fact that I've spoken to you in this. We also have Dial P for Procurement, which my colleague Kelly Barner hosts. Dial P is more of a topical podcast. She'll cover issues. She talked about the train crash where all the chemicals were spilled and how that linked back to a supply chain issue. Last week, she was talking about Kraft Heinz and the whole issue around misdeclaration of savings. So Kelly's picking some quite topical news issues and delving deeper into those. And they tend to be US focused issues. So, you know, right up your street in terms of content. And a couple of other podcasts. We have special series from time to time, and The Sourcing Hero, which interviews practitioners. So that's a really great podcast just to hear what people doing procurement are doing, you know, in the field. We also do a lot of events, so webinars, we have briefings, we have live streams on LinkedIn, we do digital events, which are a bit like conferences, all online, and we also produce a lot of written content, from white papers to blog posts to occasional research papers. What I would say about our contents is it's all free. It's all free to you. You don't have to pay. Sometimes you might have to put an email in to access something, to register, but it's all free. We don't charge practitioners and members of our community to consume our content, because we're there to help you elevate your impact and make a difference. Okay. Talked a little bit about who we are. So Philip Ideson, he's the founder of Art of Procurement. Although he's a Brit, he lives in Orlando. I was just telling Alexa about Phil being located quite near to you. And so he was in automotive, he worked in pharma, then he went into consulting. And as I said, 8 years ago, he decided to take the plunge, set his own business up and start producing the podcast. So Phil's got quite a wealth of experience and quite a lot on the direct side. The one place he hasn't worked is public procurement. Kelly Barner, she is our queen of content. She's a writer. She's published 4 books on business, finance, procurement, does a lot of our writing. And she is, her background is in retail and consulting. So she's sort of on that side of the procurement house.
Oh, that's what you wanted to know? Okay. You know, I gotta decipher.
Hold on a second there, Helen. Hi. If you guys are not speaking or asking a question, if you could please go ahead and mute yourselves. Thank you. And also, Helen, I noticed your slides, they're kind of cut off on our end. On the left, it looks like. I don't know if that's something you can adjust.
Is that better? I've made the window bigger.
No, we're still getting cut off. I don't know if you want to come off presentation mode and just kind of show the slide from
All right, just on the, yeah. Okay, hang on.
the screen.
Right, I'll do that. How about that? Is that okay? Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Right. So where was I? Back into the flow. I was telling you about myself, so CPO in public sector, and then my colleague Brittany, who does all the editing. So we're quite a small team producing all this content for you. Okay. I've got this next slide is Phil's sort of strategic statement about procurement. If it'll move, I've got to go this way now, haven't I? Here we go. Right, you won't see that because I've done some animation on the slide. But what Phil was saying there is that procurement teams can become the X factor for, and he's put profitability in that statement, which is all now muddled up because of the way that the slide works in the presentation mode. But what I think we can be in procurement is the X factor for policy impact when we're talking about public sector. So on the business side, profitability, on the public procurement side and the government procurement side, we can make an impact on policy. And that's quite a big deal, isn't it, where we're serving politicians and political objectives for our communities. But we have never had a bigger opportunity and the resources and the technology to make a difference. Okay, so that's a bit about us. I want to talk a little bit now about Mayor Fisher's priorities. You all know them well, I'm sure. Let's have a think about how procurement can deal with what he's tasked you all with in terms of his priorities. Now, first, the things I found were his 3 C's. So let's look at the first C. He talked about communication, and I've got 3 points to make to you here under this heading of communication. The first point I've put there is mind your language, and I mean I don't mean, you know, speaking politely and you know, making sure that you don't drop an expletive into the conversation. What I mean here is around the language that we use in procurement. A lot of us can see us as being very administrative. We've got these secret terms like RFP, SOW that people don't necessarily understand. And what that can tend to be to lead people to do is to switch off from us. They see us as being a sort of back office functional thing that they don't understand. There's a lot of red tape around that. So I think when we think about communication, particularly with buyers in the business, with stakeholders that we're working with in the business, if we can think about the way we're expressing ourselves and actually get the language right, we're going to make a huge impact in terms of improving our communication. And that might mean that you've got to get your ear tuned in to the way that people in the services speak. You know, if they're in transportation, perhaps they're talking about providers being or contractors. If they're in a function that's more about, say, youth services, they might be talking about suppliers or providers there. So how can we move our language from vendors or technical terms like that and really communicate? I think that's something to bear in mind. So let's speak in the language of the business and let's keep our ears open. The second point I wanted to make here is about being proactive. And when we communicate, particularly when we're out there talking about contracts and we're wanting, you know, to achieve some policy objectives, might be around local suppliers, might be around diverse suppliers. How can we be proactive in terms of how we communicate? And, you know, I think that we can do a lot to warm up the market. And I'll give you an example where we can get in ahead of things and be proactive. One of the things that we did in my old role was to do something quite different with the transportation contracts for buses, and we wanted the bus operators to do things in quite a different way in terms of the way that the contract was framed, in terms of the way that payments would be made, and we thought it would lead to much better outcomes for the communities that those services were going to provide. But in order to do that, I had to be proactive. We had to go out and engage with suppliers so they could really understand what it was we wanted. And then when we went out with the RFP, the responses we got were great because the market was warmed up. They knew what we wanted. And the operators that we wanted to reply, the local suppliers, the smaller businesses, all participated in that process. So I think there's something about communication and being proactive around that. There's also ways that you can plan ahead. I saw on the website that you've got a list of upcoming contracts there that people can have a look at. You probably do meet the buyer events where you go out and talk to local businesses and tell them what's coming and do supplier events, but that's a really proactive way of getting ahead and really ramping up the communication around that. I think the final point I'd like to make is about being intentional. You know, if you want smaller businesses to respond to your, you know, to your requirements, if you want them to put in a response to your RFP, you might have to make sure that they've actually heard about it. I mean, you can stick it up on your e-sourcing platform if you've got a way that you advertise. It might be on the website. But did they really see it? Did they open the email? Have they read it? Are they going to tender? Certainly within Scotland, we had quite a lot of regulations in the EU space about what we could or couldn't do with suppliers, but we could make sure that they'd heard what we were doing, make sure that they knew we were asking for responses, for quotes, for tenders and so on. So be intentional. If you want them to reply, make sure they know about it. Make sure they're signed up on your platform. Make sure that they've got every possibility to respond. Okay, I'll stop there because just in case there's any questions. But if not, I will move on. So the next C, as you'll know, is, if I can, oh, I'm trying to click there and I need to click there, is collaboration. So the next C in your mayor's list is collaboration. And I've got 3 points to make to you on this one as well. Better together. You'll know about contracts that public bodies buy together. I'm sure you probably do some, perhaps within Florida, perhaps within the federal contracts that you can access, perhaps even within a number of counties collaborating across Florida. And you know, an example I would give you in Scotland is collaborative contracts across all the public sector in Scotland have saved £161 million. That's a lot of money in the context of the public sector budget in Scotland. And you've got your 31 municipalities within your county and yourselves, as well as the county organisation. And, you know, I'm sure that you're working together to put shared contracts in place. And so I suppose my question to you is, could you do more? Is there more that you buy together, that you all buy, where you could collaborate and you could put some collaborative agreements in and get some group purchasing benefits from that? I think the second thing about collaboration on the buy side is about taking the lead. I mean, we can all hope that somebody else will put a collaborative contract in place, that they'll do the work, because it is a lot of work when you lead a procurement like that on behalf of a number of public bodies. But can you take the lead and move forward? Can you do something proactive around that? And I think, just to share a story from my experience, we weren't the largest public body in Scotland. We certainly weren't as large as the City of Glasgow. We didn't have a huge team like them. We weren't as big as the NHS in Scotland, that's for sure. But we led collaborative contracts on behalf of a number of bodies for things like debt collection, for payment cards, for occupational health equipment. And also locally within our area, we led across public bodies for things like grounds maintenance and repairs and maintenance. So it doesn't have to be big for you to take the lead, but can you do more? Can you collaborate more? Can you take the lead? And, you know, leading and going out, we had a contract where the whole area was served by one contractor. And that meant that only one big company, one or two big companies could bid, and lots of smaller contractors who cut grass in smaller, you know, in local areas that perhaps had one or two people, couldn't ever bid for work. So we talked to the business. We thought about contract management and how that might work if we went from one provider to 10, and actually thought it was worth taking things forward to enable those smaller businesses to bid. So we lotted the contract into smaller packages, and the good news was that we got great prices and the local suppliers won. So, you know, you can by making the packages smaller, empower your local suppliers to tender, and you need to think about that perhaps as you're going along. The second point I wanted to make is about knowing your costs. We've done quite a bit of content recently at Art of Procurement on should cost modelling, which is something we do in procurement quite a lot, isn't it? And you know, it is important to understand that, because certainly if you're talking about things like selecting suppliers that pay a decent wage, a living wage to their staff, if you're talking about suppliers that have, you know, good terms and conditions for their workforce or are more sustainable, there's a lot of, I suppose, anecdotal evidence that that's going to cost more. And I used to get quite a lot of pushback from the services that, you know, it's all right for you to say that, Helen, for us to include that. The politicians might want that, but it's just going to cost the taxpayer more to put that in. So if we have a should cost model, we can understand what bids we should be getting back. We'll understand what the cost drivers are around that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But that does mean that we should know whether there will be an implication to including a policy objective in our requirements for our suppliers. So that's just something to bear in mind before we go to market, is if, you know, if we've done our should cost modelling, we can have a really good sense of that before we do it. And also push back perhaps if we think it is going to cost more. So we had a contract where we were looking to source fruit and vegetables for the meals in our schools and our older people's care services from local suppliers, quite an agricultural community where we live here. There was obviously the thought that that might cost more. So we did some should cost modelling, we did some work around that. We thought it might cost more, and we went back to the politicians and we said, if the bid comes back and it's this much more, and we can prove that it's because we've sourced locally rather than from, you know, big huge suppliers, is that politically a price? Is that politically an outcome you want to accept? Obviously, you would balance it with price and quality within the evaluation that you would do to select your supplier, but it was important perhaps to have a conversation with our politicians before we actually went to market on that. The second point there I've got is around cost drivers. I think that there's, back to knowing what your costs are, I think we need to understand with the cost drivers where the risk is in the contract, and again where smaller suppliers, local suppliers might put more in the pricing because of the risk that they see in the contract from working with us. And, you know, you can look at the way your pricing model for your responses to balance that risk. So one example I've got is with bus contracts. So we had a lot of smaller businesses that ran bus services in our area. We wanted them to invest in accessible vehicles. So back to my first point about contract length, we wanted them to invest. We wanted vehicles that people with disabilities could access, so accessible vehicles. So there was a risk around investing in that in terms of the contract. Some of that risk we managed with contract length. The other thing we did was look to cost drivers and where the big risk was. And fuel price was something where if the price went up significantly, the supplier's profitability would be impacted. So we built in a fuel price escalator where the price of the contract could vary. So in a sense, we were bearing the risk for fuel price. They were bearing the risk in terms of the investment in the vehicles, but it worked both ways. So if the price went down, we got some benefit from the contract. If the price went up, we funded that risk in terms of the contract. So it is something where you'd need to work with finance on, because they need to understand, do they need to put some money aside if they think fuel costs are going to increase. But it did help us achieve the outcome, which was accessible vehicles, and it did help local suppliers comply with that requirement. And the final thing I wanted to talk about on this is policy versus impact. I think there's something around, particularly around diverse businesses, where the impact of putting contracts or awarding contracts to suppliers from these backgrounds versus the impact that can make on our communities actually one outweighs the other. In Scotland we have, so I'll give you an example. In Scotland we have businesses which are called supported businesses, and they're businesses where the majority of the workforce are from what we would call vulnerable groups. So they might be people with disabilities, people who have been in prison and are coming out and being rehabilitated, or people that have had mental health problems. And so those supported businesses will have that proportion of their workforce dealing with that group. And sometimes those prices would be slightly higher. So we had one that we worked with that made doors, which we used in our new build contracts. But what we found from the research that we did was, for every £1 spent with those businesses that employed people from those backgrounds, so let's just pick physical disability, say somebody who had a visual impairment but could work in the factory in some role, that actually £1 spent on a contract with that contractor actually saved the taxpayer £8, and that was in terms of healthcare services, because that person was working, their mental health and well-being was better, in terms of benefits or financial support that person might get if they weren't working, they were at home. So for £1 spent, £8 worth of benefit or savings to the taxpayer. So I don't know whether you have any research or any evidence around that, but that's something where, the policy to get people to work, to help them be economically active, to make a contribution, versus the impact on the contract, one might outweigh the other. So that's something to think about. I think the final point I want to make is around suppliers. I've talked about this, and this is probably the one I don't need to say a lot to you. I think you probably all try and buy local. You obviously try and buy from diverse businesses, with women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses. Lots of discussion about supplier diversity. We've got a lot of content that we've produced in terms of podcasts and content on the website around that, and smaller businesses, which I've talked about. So again, a lot of impact on the community that you can make there. So I think on that point, I think I want to finish and just leave it open for questions, because I know we've only got until 1:45 to do that. So I think I'd probably just want to leave you with a call to action, which is basically to say, it is time for procurement to step up, and public procurement in particular. We've got so much potential that we can do to achieve the policy objectives of the people we serve, of making a difference in the communities that we serve. So be proactive, unleash that power of public procurement, and 10x your impact. And please use the resources that we've got for you at Art of Procurement and turn that inspiration into action. And I'll leave it there, I think.
All right, thanks so much, Helen. Could you briefly, you mentioned some of the different resources, and I was kind of looking at your website. Would you be able to pop over to your website and just kind of walk us through what resources you have available for procurement professionals?
Yeah, hang on. I'll just put this up.
And while she's doing that, guys, if you have any questions for Helen, feel free to go ahead and type them in the chat.
Right, hold on. I just, I'll be a sec. I'll do it in a different tab. I was trying to do it in.
Hey, Alexa, while she's doing that, could I offer a few words?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Bob.
All right, thank you. First, thank you, Helen, for agreeing to represent Art of Procurement during our Lunch and Learn sessions. I apologize, I had to miss the first few minutes of our session, but you did reach out to me, and I appreciate you doing that. I've followed Art of Procurement for quite a long time. I've talked with Kelly Barner back in Virginia around 2014, 2015, and so I very much appreciate it. Out of the things that you mentioned, I would just like to emphasize a couple of things. The other C that came to my mind when I was looking at your communication, et cetera, it reminded me a lot of supplier relationship management and some of the factors that go into that. But change is the other C that came to my mind, and making sure that we accommodate change in our contracts. And then you hit it again too when you talked about scope, length, and lotting. Allowing for change within the term of an agreement, I think is something that our people need to do here. The fact that you mentioned intentional, that spoke to me, and taking the lead in doing what we have to do is something that sometimes is difficult because we get complacent. And if anybody gets complacent in procurement, you're dead in the water, because reality is going to overwhelm you, and your contracts are not going to be able to accommodate the changes that reality brings. So those are some of the things. And the last one was leadership. Everything that you mentioned speaks to leadership, and that's something that I would encourage all of our purchasing agents here on this call. And we also have some members of the audience that are not in procurement, but they do operate in the environment that we do our business. So anyway, I just want to offer some thanks and emphasize some of the points that you made to our audience. Say hello to Phil for me, and also Kelly. Thanks.
Yes, I will. So yeah, thank you for that, Robert. And I would echo that around leadership. I think there's a lot we can do around leadership if we get sort of tooled up. I think there's a lot to be said for understanding the context we work in, understanding the rules and the regulations, or the governance, the sign-offs, and being really comfortable in that. That's what I operated in the EU space, and there's a lot of regulations there. But if you know that, then you know where you can be creative, as Robert says, where you've got the ability to work to factor in change. And I think that that's really helpful. Right, here's the website. Hopefully you can see it. So we've had a redesign, so Phil's now got this flashy graphic going on at the front. So on the home page, you'll see here, what we've published recently, and it's a very good example of what we have on offer. So obviously, primarily the podcasts. You'll see there's one there on Monday where we've got somebody talking about AI. Procurement 6, which I mentioned, which is our news type issue. Kelly was in the hot seat last Friday. There's the should cost analysis that I mentioned there in that one, and so on. So we've on the homepage, it will tell you what the new things are. I'll just scroll up, hopefully not make people feel queasy. So on the digital events tab, we've got what we've got coming up in terms of our events. So if you click on that tab, you'll see everything that's coming up. As I say, it's free to register there. In resources, I'll just go onto this page so you can see we've got things categorized here by the type of content they are. So white papers, webinar recordings, briefings, and so on. And there's a search function, so you could search for, I don't know, whatever supplier. And it'll hopefully it'll do it for me. There you are. So you can search and find what we've got. We've also got insights by topics. So if you want to look at it that way, you can go onto that page, and we've actually grouped some content that way. So I think that's a fairly straightforward website in terms of what we've got. As I said, the podcasts are on the feed, so you can either access them through the website. If you sign up to the email, which comes twice a week on a Monday and a Friday, the link to the podcast will be there, plus any other content we've got available. And if you're like me and you listen to loads of podcasts on Apple Podcasts, it's in Apple, it's in Spotify. So yeah, they're the resources we've got. There's also things like the expense management cheat sheet, which gives some tips on things you might want to think about to reduce costs in your contracts. And from time to time we do other things like that. So that's our resources.
Okay, thank you so much. So want to give everyone one last opportunity if there are any questions. If you guys, I see a question here. Is there a cost for any of the services that you're providing?
No, it's all free. So as I said, sometimes to access something, you might have to put an email address in. But apart from that, no, it's all free. So we've got all of that available to you. And the other thing I would say to people is please connect with me on LinkedIn. You'll find me there, Helen Mackenzie, and my handle is Crazy in Love with Procurement. So the Beyonce of procurement, perhaps, or not. So that's me. Reach out to me, connect with me. As I say, I've worked in government procurement. I've got lots of people in my network who are in government procurement. So if I don't know the answer or I can't help with that or get you connected with somebody to give you some new ideas, I'm sure I can find people in my network that can. So whatever category you're buying, you know, please reach out, because I know that we did all the great things we did in my team because we stood on the shoulders of other people. We found out what other people were doing. We worked out how it would work for our community, for our area. And, you know, we did great things. And I think the public sector is a great place for sharing great practice. So, you know, connect with me and ask me anything, and I'll try and find you somebody who knows the answer if I don't know it myself.
All right, thank you so much, Helen. We're just about out of time. If you guys have any additional questions for Helen, please feel free to let me know. What I will do after the session that is being recorded, I will send you a link to our Lunch and Learn series. And then in that will also be Helen's contact information. So thank you so much to Helen, all the way from across the pond, for sharing your information on art of procurement with us. And thank you guys for spending another great lunch and learn with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.